Hey, this is Scott, and today I'm going to talk about the Canon 5D Mark IV. Alright, so before we start, I just want to say if you're not following me on social media, please check me out, Scott Dumas Photography, on either Facebook or Instagram. So if you haven't watched my last video, you can watch it here. It's talking about the reasons why I personally changed from Nikon to Canon. I just want to address one thing that people were asking about that video. No, I do not shoot only in JPEG. I at least shoot with RAW and JPEG to one card each. And that's mostly in cases where I'm not going to be processing or retouching each one of the individual pictures. For example, vacation pictures, pictures with my family going to the park, even wedding receptions and other events where I'm taking hundreds or thousands of pictures, and I'm not going to need to retouch or process every single one of those. I do also shoot in RAW in those situations just in case I need it, but most of the time if the JPEG is usable, it's a huge help, both time and effort-wise. If it's a studio shot or a portrait shot where I know I'm going to be retouching or processing or trying to really polish those images, of course I will shoot RAW only, and I'll do RAW to both cards so that way I have a backup in case anything happens. Just wanted to clear that up. Alright, so let's get into some of the specs of the 5D Mark IV. It's a 30 megapixel sensor, and the ISO range goes up to 32,000 natively, which is a third of a stop higher than the 5D Mark III. However, it does have on-chip conversion, which allows for better performance at identical ISOs. I'll talk more about that later. Let me check my notes. It has Wi-Fi and GPS. As far as the button layout goes, it's almost identical. There is a new button on the back which allows you to toggle between the different area, autofocus, area, select modes, whatever. The other buttons do have more customization than the 5D Mark III, although I would like a little bit more. They are more in-camera lens corrections available, as well as flicker detection. This is also really nice, and I will talk about that more later as well. The LCD screen on the back is a higher resolution, and it is a touchscreen which is fully functional. It's available in the menu as well as in playback mode, and also you can use it during live view and video to touch to focus, and also you can take a picture just by tapping on the back screen. It's very responsive. It feels pretty much like a smartphone. The only thing is there is no double tap to zoom in. You have to pinch to zoom. The dual pixel autofocus in live view and video mode is phenomenal. It works really great, fast, smooth, and accurate. And together with object and face detection and tracking, it allows for really good and easy to use autofocus in both live view and in video. The dual pixel RAW feature, which they keep talking about, is pretty much useless. The autofocus micro adjust, which they've talked a lot about, is really micro, as some other people have also mentioned. It's not usable. It's pretty much a gimmick, but I do hope that they will refine that feature in future versions, and maybe it will become something that does revolutionize DSLR photography. Who knows? For now, it's a pain. It doubles your file size, and the benefit is pretty much nothing. Even the bokeh shift is, I don't know why anybody would want to do that. It just seems like a gimmick to me. Or the very early stages of something that will be developed to be nice in the future. The autofocus points in the viewfinder are slightly expanded from the 5D Mark III, and if you're shooting side by side or back to back with the Mark III, you will notice that difference. The points also blink in red, light up in red, but they do not stay steadily, constantly lit. They only blink. It is an improvement from the 5D Mark III, which doesn't light up at all unless you move the focus points. But still, I would love to see a constantly lit up focus point. I think that the 1DX Mark II does that. I don't know why they would not feature it in this camera or in any camera. Even the blinking red autofocus points are pretty hard to see. So it's not incredibly helpful, but it is better than the Mark III. The autofocus tracking is improved over the Mark III, and the focusing ability in low light is also improved over the Mark III. Mark III was already pretty good in focusing in low light. I would say better than my D810 was, but the Mark IV can focus in pretty much all the same situations as my Nikon D4S did. Although the D4S was noticeably faster to find focus, the 5D Mark IV does focus in those situations, and the 5D Mark III can't keep up quite as much. But it is better than the D810. Okay, now let's dive more in detail to some of these different specs and features of the camera. Alright, well let's start out by looking at the ISO performance of the 5D Mark III versus the 5D Mark IV. So I imported these raw files into Capture One Pro, and I didn't do anything besides what Capture One does automatically upon import. I started out with an ISO of 6400, the Mark III is on the left, and the Mark IV is on the right. If we look over at the texture of the wood here, I think that the Mark IV has slightly more color saturation and a little more contrast, but the difference is not so noticeable just yet. There's slightly more noise here in the shadows on the top. The Mark IV looks a bit cleaner up here. Let's go to ISO 10,000. Again, let's look at the wood on the side here. You can start to notice a little bit more muddiness coming into the Mark III, and the Mark IV still has a pretty crispy detail to it. And again, the contrast looks a bit better on the Mark IV. The Mark III on the left here has noticeably more noise in these shadows over here. And if you look at the top of the bag as well, it seems like there's a lot more detail in the Mark IV file than the Mark III. I'm going to jump up to ISO 16,000, and this is where on the Mark III, again on the left, I started to notice some weird colors coming in and starting to almost become a little bit of a gray, while the Mark IV has a good saturation still, and the colors are very true to the wood color. Again, looking up in the shadows on the top, there is still noticeably more noise on the Mark III. Now I want to jump up to the highest ISO on the Mark III, and you can see it's really fallen apart in terms of color and also noise here on the wood. And the Mark IV is starting to show some false color as well, but it still looks better. Looking at these shadows up top here, there's noticeably more noise on the Mark III. I'd say the Mark IV is still holding on to more detail, more saturation, more contrast, and all that. And let's just look at the highest ISO on the Mark IV compared to the Mark III. In the Mark IV, it goes up to ISO 32,000, and on the left we have the Mark III's maximum 25,600. They're both looking pretty bad at this level. But I think there is still more noise on the Mark III file, and the colors are much more washed out. If I had to say, I think that, yeah, I believe these are the two files, the 25,600 and the 16,000 on the Mark III are pretty comparable, which gives the Mark IV almost a stop advantage over the Mark III. But I would say that the Mark IV file still does look more saturated, more contrasty than the Mark III. I don't know if that's because of the higher pixel count or what, but especially in the yellows of the bag, the Mark IV looks a bit better to me. Okay, so one quick thing that I noticed when I was looking at the pictures I used for the ISO test is that I got a kind of variation in the exposure, which you can see here looks almost like a shadow rolling across the frame. This is due to the flicker of the lights in my house, and I've experienced this before. I was doing a shoot outside, but I didn't know there was going to be lights ahead. It was kind of under a roof, but the roof was open, but the lights from all around still affected the shot, and that was really bad. There was variation of not only exposure but color across every single frame, and it was just a nightmare trying to process those pictures. So the 5D Mark IV has a flicker detection, which, as you can see here, as I scroll through, totally eliminates that problem. What it does is it times the shots with the flicker of the lights to avoid getting that variation in exposure. If you don't have this feature, you would either have to use additional lighting or use the shutter speed slow enough to get the whole cycle of that flickering. I was shooting action outside, so neither of those were either kind of like a realistic option for me. Having this flicker detection feature would have been a lifesaver in that situation. Some people have talked about a sudden change in white balance or exposure for no apparent reason. I just want to say that in all of my shooting, all of my testing, I haven't noticed this at all. There's been perfectly normal consistency in all of my shots except for what I talked about with the flicker of the lights. Otherwise, the variation in color temperature and exposure is no more or no less than I've seen in any other camera from both Canon or Nikon. So the 5D Mark IV has a new feature where there's two auto white balance options, and one of them is supposed to give you truer whites even under tungsten lights, for example, and the regular standard auto white balance will give a slightly warmer tone. Now these shots here are shot with the white priority auto white balance, and this shot is the slightly warmer standard auto white balance. Flipping back and forth between the two, you can see there is a difference in the whites. And I could be wrong about this, but I think that the other colors are relatively untouched, and it does really focus on just the whites. And this is supported by the raw files, which actually don't change in white balance. The color shift is not just a white balance shift to a warmer tone or something. The processing or the rendering in camera is actually different, even at the same Kelvin white balance. This could be great, for example, for wedding photographers. Obviously, you want to get a nice, true white dress, but you don't want to sacrifice the nice, warmer skin tones. So this will apparently whiten up that dress without ruining the skin. I'll have to test it out at a wedding or in a situation like that for sure, but it seems to be the case. People also seem disappointed that Canon stuck with the SD and CF cards in this camera, and they say it's kind of old technology in a new camera. And while that is true, I don't think that it's the cards that's holding the camera back. For stills, it's fine, and I'll talk about that in a minute. For video, I think that Canon decided to put the features that they did and then figured out afterwards that the current cards were enough for those features. I think it was more of an active decision by Canon to limit their video features the way they did, instead of a limitation of the cards. Okay, before getting more into video, I just wanted to talk about how the buffer performance is on the Mark IV versus the Mark III. It's using the same cards, but the performance is quite improved as far as how many shots you can take before the buffer fills up
and also how fast the buffer will clear after that. It's a lot of information, so I just gonna throw it up on screen here. You can pause the video if you want, or you can just continue. I included the silent mode shooting because, for example, wedding photographers I think will definitely use that feature, but might still be concerned about how the performance of the Mark IV is compared to the Mark III.
A lot of people were disappointed with the video features of the Mark IV. And while I don't disagree with the reasons why those people are disappointed, I want to talk about first the things that I personally like about the features that the 5D Mark IV offers for video. The first, and to me kind of most important feature, is autofocus during video. Now, this is dual pixel autofocus, which means that it's accurate, smooth, fast, and also it has face detection, which means that I can start recording, walk in front of the camera, and it will focus on my face, and it will track it as well. It tracks my face as I move, and I don't have to worry about setting up a light stand, focusing on the light stand, and then trying to come and stand in exactly the same spot as the light stand. For example, now I'm shooting with the 135 f2 at f2. If I was doing that technique, I would almost certainly miss the spot and be slightly out of focus. But with the autofocus and face detection video on the Mark IV, I can just walk in front and it will focus on my face. Makes shooting my own video much, much easier. Now, if I'm not shooting myself, it also has the tap to focus feature during video as well as still shooting. You can use the touchscreen on the back to tap wherever you want to focus, and because it's the dual pixel autofocus, it will focus really accurately and really smoothly. It doesn't hunt for focus, and it will stay locked on to that object or person as they move around in the frame or as the camera moves. Another feature that I really like is the HDR video. It's only available in 1080p and up to 30 frames per second. The reason for this is that it actually shoots 60 frames per second, alternating the exposure and then combining those two exposures into a 30 frames per second video. Of course, 60 frames per second is not available during 4K, so you can't do it in 4K. It's only two exposures, so it's not as extreme of a HDR effect as most people think when they hear the word HDR. I think it's more of a subtle, nice way to bring back some of the details from the blown highlights, and it's a really nice little touch.
As you can see here, it's not an extreme effect, but on the right side, if you look at the top of the boxes and also the wood shelf or windowsill that it's on, there's a lot more detail in those areas which are blown out without the HDR effect.
So now to talk about the things that people are disappointed in. The 4K video is kind of the main focus of this disappointment. It doesn't shoot in 60p, and it's using motion JPEG format, which is extremely large. I took like a less than 1 minute video and it was 2.5 gigs, and just that's insane. The quality is fine, it's no problem, but it's just the file size is huge, and most people don't need that. The reason that they did it is, they say, for stability issues and whatnot, but also so that way you can pull 8 megapixel stills from the 4K footage. I don't think this is something that people are actually going to use. Also, 1080p is not available in 120 frames per second, which people were also disappointed about. The 120 frames per second is only available in 720p, and even then the camera will automatically kind of bake it down into a slow motion video for you, and you can't control that afterwards. For me personally, those downsides, while I agree with, don't bother me. The things that I mentioned before, as far as autofocus, dual pixel, and tracking in video, as well as live view shooting, really outweigh the negatives for the video features in this camera. I think most of the people who are disappointed in this camera's video features really wanted to use this as a video camera, but I think Canon intended it to be a stills camera, which had pretty good video features as well. If you look at the video features compared to the other features of this camera, it kind of follows the pattern. 30 megapixels is not the most on the market, but it's also not the least. 7 frames per second is not the most, but it's also not the least. And the same with the video. All of those features are not the best on the market, but they're not the worst either. And I think things like dual pixel autofocus, for me, really set it apart from other systems as for video.
So the 5D Mark IV has Wi-Fi, which allows you to use your smartphone or tablet as a monitor or control center for your camera. You can swipe to adjust your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed straight from the app, as well as start and stop recording. You can switch between stills and video mode as well. After you finish, you can press the icon in the bottom left corner to view your photos or videos as well. You can use the same touch to focus ability as the touchscreen on the back of the camera. And of course, this is still using Canon's dual pixel RAW, so you can see that the focus is very smooth, it doesn't hunt, and actually, once you lock focus onto an object, if you move the camera or if that object or person moves, it will follow them around the frame. And this happens whether the camera is moving or the person is moving. And it will track them side to side as well as to and from the camera. It works pretty smoothly. There's almost no lag. It's pretty close to the same experience as using the back of the camera. And it allows you to monitor the video without having to do anything else besides get the Wi-Fi set up and connected.
Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the smaller features that I noticed were either upgraded from the Mark III or were different from the D810 and other Nikon bodies that I've used. The first thing is that I was always a back button focus user, but I found that for some reason when I switched to the 5D, I liked using the half press to focus. Part of this is because you can assign a button to switch between AI servo and one shot. On the Mark III, most people talk about assigning the depth of field preview button to this function, and it works alright, but on the Mark IV, you can assign other buttons, namely the AF on button on the back to do that same function. I find that the AF on position is much more natural for me to hold while I'm shooting, to switch between AI servo and one shot, especially when you're shooting in portrait mode, either with your hand on top or your hand on the bottom. With especially the portrait modes, holding positions, whatever, the depth of field preview button gets a little bit tricky to push while you're trying to hold the shutter as well. So it feels really natural and really easy to use that AF on button to switch between. I keep it in AI servo, and when I push it, it switches to one shot. I use AI servo more often, so I keep that as the main function, and pushing the button will switch to the one shot, which I occasionally use. Another feature, which is available on both the Mark III and the Mark IV, but not so easily done on the Nikon bodies, is that there's a rate button on the back of the camera, which allows you to immediately rate your images as you're reviewing them, and you can customize it to either go cycle through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars when you push the button, or you can customize that to anything. I have it set so only the 1-star option is available. When I push it once, the 1-star rating will come on, and when I push it again, it will delete that 1-star rating. For me, just on or off is easiest. I can pick the best shots from each moment, and that in combination with the in-camera slideshow, you can go into the slideshow and create a slideshow from all your 1-star images, and you can show that to the client. You could also put the images onto a computer and very quickly choose the 1-star images that you rated in camera and make a slideshow in a very short amount of time, for example at a wedding reception. It's a very convenient feature, especially since there's a button dedicated to that, and you can use it together with the slideshow in camera, or to make culling a little bit faster afterwards. When it comes to the shutter noise, the silent mode in Canon cameras is extremely quiet when compared especially to Nikon bodies. The D810 silent or quiet shooting mode was my favorite sound in all of the Nikon bodies that I've used, but still compared to that, Canon silent mode is truly worlds away from it. And on top of that, there's a new mirror mechanism in the 5D Mark IV, which makes even the regular high-speed continuous shooting very quiet. It's not so much louder than the silent mode actually. And when compared to the regular high-speed shutter on the 5D Mark III, or especially compared to a lot of Nikon bodies, it's very, very quiet, especially for event or wedding photographers. That quiet shutter is really, really key. The last very small point is that the Mark IV uses USB 3, same as the Nikon D810 does. I had a lot of issues with the D810's USB port. It was always very loose and wiggly, and even with the booster pack from Tether Tools, I kind of often easily lost connection. If I was shooting on a tripod, it was mostly okay, but as soon as I started hand holding, there was so much wiggle that it was very easy to come out. Even with the jerk stopper from Tether Tools, wasn't enough. I ended up using the little, I don't know what you call it, kind of supporter bracket that's supplied with the camera, but that supporter bracket doesn't fit the Tether Tools cable, so I had to use the supporter bracket, which was included with the camera, with the cable that was included with the camera plugged into an extension cable from Tether Tools, which was then plugged into the booster because the USB 3 signal tends to drop out easily over long distances. And then finally that was plugged into my computer. It was a huge hassle and really kind of made me not want to shoot tethered if I didn't have to. Now, on top of that, the little bracket that was included with the camera for the D810 was really, really flimsy feeling. I thought for sure I would break it at some point. But the bracket, which is included with the Canon camera, feels much, much more sturdy, strong, and overall a better design, I think. It's easier to take it on and off of the cable, and it just seems a lot more functional to me. The D810's bracket kind of pushed and snapped into place, and pulling it out, I was always worried that I was either going to break it or even bend the plug, the USB cable, when I'm trying to wiggle and pull that out of there. But the 5D Mark IV bracket actually screws into the body with a little screw, so taking it out is as simple as unscrewing that. And also, it's two pieces, so you can remove the cable with that piece before you actually unscrew and remove the second piece from the body. I think it feels a lot more safe, secure, strong, and well designed. So again, it's a small detail, but if you shoot tethered a lot, it makes it a lot easier and it feels a lot better.
Okay, so this is just a little quick summary of the negatives and positives of the 5D Mark IV. Start off with the negatives. The 4K usability, of course, is overall just really bad. Slow cards are definitely a no-go in this camera. You'll be severely limited with the amount of time of 4K video that you can record. So if you do shoot 4K, you need to get fast cards. The file size is also huge, and the 8 megapixel still grabs that you can get from the 4K video I think is really unlikely to be a popular feature. The lack of 120 frames per second in 1080p was also disappointing to a lot of videographers. The autofocus points still only blink, and in that they're hardly visible. It is better than the Mark III, but I don't know why they can't just be steadily lit up. The price is also a negative. It's expensive when you compare it to the competition from Nikon, Sony, etc., but it is consistent with the past 5D's price at the time of release. There's no Bluetooth. Something like SnapBridge that uses a low power connection would be better than Wi-Fi. It still has the AA filter. Not a big deal. The images are still very sharp. And there's no double tap to zoom into the images on the screen when you're reviewing pictures. It's just a little bit of a disconnect with the usability compared to a smartphone or a tablet. Now getting into the strong points, and this is again from my point of view and for my style of shooting. The autofocus in general, especially when compared to the Mark III or especially the Mark II, is a big improvement in a lot of ways. Dual pixel autofocus is just incredible, absolutely awesome, especially when you pair that with object and face tracking, both in video and still shooting. The low light autofocus is really good, and the autofocus speed and accuracy is also really great. The touchscreen in the back is very easy to use in both the menu and in video and still shooting. If you don't need it, it's not really in the way. You can just turn it off, not like a flip screen where it's always there, even if you don't want that feature. I think most people will like it though, at least for some purpose, whether it's to use it in video or to scroll through the menus. I think everybody will enjoy it in one way or another. The ISO performance is also really great. It really holds on to color accuracy, saturation, contrast, even into the high ISOs. The HDR video is also really useful. It's not too strong of an effect. It's a nice subtle way to pull back your highlights. And 30 megapixels for me is a sweet spot compared to the larger 50 megapixel 5DS, and even it's only 6 megapixels different, but it is a bit smaller than the Nikon D810, and the lower megapixel count's 24 megapixels. 30 is a really good spot for me. The button customization is really good. I would like a little bit more, but it is a big step up from the 5D Mark III, and it's just very easy to use ergonomics. And finally, the flicker detection is very helpful and very effective. It's a very small detail, but it's one that I'm very glad this camera has. Okay, so overall, I'd highly recommend this camera to anyone who's buying into the 5D line for the first time or upgrading from the Mark II. If you have the money, I do think it is a worthy upgrade from the Mark III, but if you're heavy into video, I would hold off on this. It's inferior to other cameras that are on the market, and they come in at lower prices. Also, if you're mainly a sports or a wildlife photographer, there are better options with higher frames per second, but if it's not your main thing, this will get by just fine with 7 frames per second. Landscape photographers also might opt for the 50 megapixels of the 5DS or the huge dynamic range of the Nikon D810 or something similar to that. But again, the 5D Mark IV is not so far behind.
If you're still watching, I just want to say thank you so much. I was really surprised about the reaction to my last video, so thank you to everybody who's checked that out as well. I'd love to hear from you about what kind of content you'd hope to see on this channel, so please leave any recommendations or requests in the comments below. Also, any questions or comments or even corrections about this video, I'd love to hear from you below as well. Please don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.